Tonight on KQED Newsroom, the largest wildfire in state history continues to rage. A look at why it's proving so destructive and what's to blame. And a look at rent control and what Proposition 10 would do to expand it across the state. Also, we hear from a startup CEO about winning over consumers by ditching brand labels. Hello and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Marisa Lagos in for Thuy Vu. We begin with wildfires. Earlier this week, the Mendocino Complex Fire, which is comprised of two big blazes, became the largest recorded in state history. So far, it's burned more than 300,000 acres. California firefighters are currently battling 17 large fires around the state, including the Carr Fire, where at least 8 people have died and 1,000 homes have been destroyed in Redding. Another blaze, the Ferguson Fire, started 4 weeks ago and has led to the indefinite closure of Yosemite National Park during peak tourist season. We're only halfway into this year's fire season, and it may well be on track to be the worst on record. Joining me now to discuss this are UC Berkeley fire scientist Brandon Collins and publisher of the Mendocino Voice, Kate Maxwell. She joined us via Skype. Thanks to both of you for being here.
Sure.
Kate, can you just give us an update on how things are going in Mendocino and what progress firefighters have made in recent days?
Sure. So the fires have slowed in recent days, which is a big relief for people here in Mendocino and Lake counties. A lot of the mandatory evacuations have been lifted. A lot of the advisory evacuations have been downgraded, so people have been able to return to their homes. The river fire, which is the fire primarily to the south, has slowed in growth. And there has also been a slowing of growth of the ranch fire, which has been very active up until early this week. So things are looking good on that front.
So some good news there, but of course, Redwood Valley in Mendocino was devastated last year by another deadly fire. KQED's investigation found a lot of problems with evacuation orders and communications in that case. How have things compared this year? Has it been a better situation?
You know, the fires in the fall were really terrifying because they started in the middle of the night in a fairly rural community that is pretty populated, but people weren't able to get out quickly or be notified in time. I think one significant difference this year is that most of the evacuations have happened during the day. People are a lot more alert and aware about how to receive emergency evacuations, and the local agencies have been really doing a good job about trying to get that information out to everyone as quickly as possible. So there has been a shift, but people remain on edge after that experience. It was the deadliest fire in Mendocino history. So
yeah, I can't imagine how terrifying this has been a second year in a row. Brandon, you conduct research on forest management. You study these things. And I cover politics. There's been a lot of talk in Sacramento in recent weeks around issues like fire suppression and the history and how that's sort of fueling these bigger blazes. Is that a fair characterization, I guess, to start?
Sure, it is. I mean, there's certainly a component to fire suppression itself in the fact that it's sort of removed one of the regulating mechanisms for fuels and for vegetation development. But there's other aspects as well.
Yeah, so talk about this. I mean, how much of what we're seeing now, in your mind, is the result of climate change and drought and sort of some of these extraordinary conditions? And how much of it is because of what we have or haven't done in terms of forest management and other, policies?
You know, it's hard to put a number on that, of course, but I would say, there's probably equal parts there, just for simplicity. The fact that throughout the state, we're pushing probably 100 years in many areas for fire suppression. That's quite a bit of time for accumulation of fuel and, again, for regeneration of other vegetation as well. So there's no doubt that that's fueling it, but the climate aspect of it is real as well.
Yeah. And in your mind, I mean, we hear a lot of talk, I think, especially among Republicans, that part of this is due to environmental regulations and challenges when people do want to do this vegetation management. Do you think that the state needs to be taking a lead and changing some of those policies?
I think they are. In some ways, it's happening right now. It's probably not happening quickly enough, but it's being recognized that there is that's a hindrance to doing some of the treatments that we need on the landscapes.
Kate, I want to turn back to you. You were there this week when U.S. Senator Kamala Harris visited one of the fire zones. I know she called for more federal help, both around fighting fires and paying for that, but also this forest management issue. Give us a sense of what she said and how hopeful she seemed that the federal government will come through on that.
You know, Senator Harris was in Middletown yesterday, and she stopped by one of the evacuation centers and talked to people in Lake County, many of whom have been evacuated multiple times over the last couple of years, and also with the firefighters there. And, you know, one of the things that she emphasized was that federal funding is really essential in order to combat fires on this scale. This really is the new normal, and California has put a lot of money into fighting these fires, but she also brought up the need for local control in terms of wildland management. So beyond getting more federal monies into these regions, I think she also emphasized the need to listen to the expertise of the firefighters and the agencies here on the ground in California who have been dealing with these things, and also who have a lot of information and knowledge about how to do better wildland management year-round, sort of, you know, both controlled burns and also how to take care of the national forests.
Which is, of course, a double-edged sword, because I know we've also seen locals allow building in areas that are very dangerous fire zones. We have a few minutes left. I do want to touch on the Donald Trump tweets. Our president tweeted this week basically blaming environmental policies around water for these fires. Brandon, is that a fair characterization? Seems not so much.
Well, you know, as with many of those, there's a little bit of truth in there, but you know, to put the blame solely on that, of course, is not probably accurate. Because
what we're talking about, Kate, I know, is whether there's enough water to fight these fires. You said earlier that there's been a lot of conversation about these tweets in Mendocino. What are you hearing from folks there about the president's characterization? You know, I think politics in Mendocino don't always break down neatly along party lines. People here do feel connected to the landscape, and they care about drought and water management policy. But I think there's also a lot of concern for people who can see these wildlands in their backyards, or who really are living in the forest, and they can see how the fire season is getting longer, and how water reserves are drying up in a way that is not necessarily directly linked to water policy. So I think and water is obviously always a controversial issue in California. We saw already sort of some movement by federal officials to use those around policy. I mean, do you think this is something that the federal government could use to undermine environmental regulations in California? Or do you think it's a one-off from the president?
I think there are enough safeguards in place right now that we're not going to really be able to circumvent a lot of the you know, protections from an environmental standpoint. But what I'd like to see is us work within the bounds that we have right now to just expand our efforts, because I don't think that we're solely limited right now by the regulation itself. There's enough we can do right now, even with existing regulation. So
it sounds like what you're saying is that it's more a will and the funding than policy changes. I know, you know, in Sacramento, they're debating a lot of policy changes. I mean, is there one thing you think that lawmakers should be doing this year?
I would honestly like to see a push just towards basically movement on treating more acres. I mean, I know that seems like a very simplistic sort of answer, but I think we know enough now from the science and even from the land management perspective to move forward without, you know, cause for concern that we're going to do something terrible. So I think we can just push forward and learn along the way, as opposed to getting it all right before we get going.
We're going to leave it there. Brandon Collins from UC Berkeley, thanks so much. And Kate Maxwell from the Mendocino Voice, we appreciate you both joining us. This November, California voters will decide the fate of 11 ballot measures. One of them, Proposition 10, could vastly expand rent control by letting cities cap the rent on any residential property, even new ones. Proponents argue that the measures needed to address the state's housing shortage and high cost of living. Opponents claim Prop 10 would discourage new development, lead to more evictions, and take rental units off the market. Joining me now with analysis are KQED politics and government reporter Guy Marzorati, San Francisco tenants' right attorney Joseph Tobner, who supports Proposition 10, and Deborah Carlton, Senior Vice President of the California Apartment Association, who opposes the measure. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
So, Guy,
let's start with you. I want you to just sort of lay out what would Proposition 10 do and, as importantly, not do.
Yeah, maybe let's start there. I think, you know, if Proposition 10 passed, it wouldn't put rent control in every city in California. What it would really do is let cities, give the power back to cities to make that decision. So cities that haven't been able to put in place rent control would be able to if Prop 10 passes. Then there are the cities that have historically had rent control back in the day, a handful in the Bay Area. They would be able to expand their rent control laws. And then I think there's a couple provisions that have been banned by the state for the last couple decades because of Costa-Hawkins, which would be repealed by this. And the two things that people are really focusing on, number one, around single-family homes cannot be rent controlled currently. Condos cannot be rent controlled currently. And also, when a tenant moves out of a unit, landlords currently can then hike up the rent. All those things would be banned by if Proposition 10 passes.
So really opening up a lot more options to cities who choose to exercise them.
Exactly.
Before we move on to our other panelists, tell us who put this on the ballot and kind of who's putting money into both sides.
So the yes side is really being driven by the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. This is based in LA. Michael Weinstein is leading it. They've taken on some big ballot initiatives in the past on the state level around prescription drug prices, adult films, some local slow growth measures. They're the big financial backers of this. They put in $10 million to the campaign last week, but they're still going to be expected to be outspent by the no side. We have developers up and down the state opposing this measure.
So Joseph Tomner, you represent tenants who are being evicted and having other troubles with landlords. Tell me why you're in favor of this measure.
Well, this is about giving control back to localities. The Costa-Hawkins has created a lot of problems for localities. It's created a lot of fraud in rent control, and it's taken a lot of units out of the rental housing stock that otherwise would be in the rental housing stock because of TIC and condo conversion.
So you think that this would actually help these tenants? Deborah, you have another position. I mean, why is this a bad idea in your mind?
Well, you know, the legislature understood back in the 90s that Costa-Hawkins was needed. Because there were we call them extreme forms of rent control, and that is cities were imposing it on single-family homes, they were imposing it on new construction, and property owners were getting out. Even in Berkeley, we lost about 3,000 single-family homes because owners says, I'm not going to work under this system. If Prop 10 passes and turns it back to the cities, I think that unfortunately we're going to see that again. We already see owners getting out of the market, and this will be just worse.
Is vacancy control, which Guy mentioned, this ability to essentially hold the price of a unit when somebody moves out, is that the biggest fear, would you say?
That's certainly a big concern for us. That's kind of a line for us. Vacancy decontrol means that an owner maybe have had a tenant in place for a historically long time, so they may be below the market. So in San Francisco, you can't raise your rents but 60% of the consumer price index. If you have a tenant that's been in there for sometimes 30 years, you're way behind. So at vacancy decontrol, they can move it to the market or whatever the market will bear.
I mean, Joseph, it seems like you guys are kind of saying the same thing but on opposite sides, which is that you feel like this would help tenants, and Deborah's sort of saying that this could hurt them. I mean, what do you see as the benefit of rent control?
Well, regarding this notion that we're going to see extreme rent control, that's just not true and not the reality. And I think it's mostly a scare tactic. I mean, that's a scary word, extreme rent control, and that's kind of an industry word. And the reality is that cities and counties can't even pass vacancy control. They can't even administer vacancy control statutes. Berkeley had vacancy control, and they spent $500,000 in the 1990s to defend their vacancy control ordinance. There's lots of litigation surrounding vacancy control. All landlords are allowed to come back and ask for a fair return, and they're entitled to a hearing, and those hearings are expensive. They last 3 days. I've been litigating in vacancy control statutes for the last 20 years in the mobile home context. It's hugely expensive for cities and counties, and it's just not going to come to reality. And the fact of the matter is for 20 years before Costa-Hawkins, cities and counties had the opportunity to pass these vacancy control statutes, and they didn't. There are a few extreme localities that will probably have vacancy control, like Berkeley or Santa Monica, but these larger cities and this notion that extreme rent control is going to proliferate, it's just not going to happen.
I mean, Guy, Joe's talking about sort of the politics of this, which I think leads into why this is on the ballot to begin with. I guess to start, can you kind of explain what's happened or not happened in the legislature over the last 20-some years? And then also, I mean, do you think it's realistic that a lot of cities will be rushing? I mean, it seems like there would be a fight at the local level on any attempts to change whatever happens.
Right. I think it's been at the legislature a lot of not happening. We saw earlier this year attempt to repeal Costa-Hawkins fail. I think the Apartment Association can talk a little bit about maybe the attempts to get this off the ballot even after it qualified. But this is the initiative system. I think a lot of lawmakers in Sacramento might be willing to reform rent control laws, maybe move buildings in on a rolling basis. We don't have this. This is either you repeal Costa-Hawkins or keep the status quo, as Sinatra would say, all or nothing at all. That's our initiative system. But as to what cities would do in reaction to this, I think there's a lot of uncertainty. You have, Berkeley has really been the only city in the Bay Area to move forward and kind of lay out a plan and say, if Prop 10 passes, this is what we would do. We'd move buildings 20 years and older into rent control. We'd bring back vacancy controls. Other cities, there's just a lot of uncertainty.
I mean, Deborah, do you feel like in some ways the real estate and development industry brought this on because of how hard any attempts to change this have been fought in the legislature?
There was never a conversation or the ability to have a conversation about a middle ground or a compromise. The proponents of the bill was AB 1506, said it's repeal Costa-Hawkins or nothing. So we never were able to get to the table and have that conversation, which I think would have been much more beneficial than going to the ballot.
But in years past, I mean, I know the realtors, for example, are one of the biggest spenders in Sacramento, and they've fought any attempts to change this. I mean, in hindsight, do you think that's what led us to this situation politically?
Perhaps, but 1506 was the first real attempt.
Okay.
And so we hadn't really seen that before because Costa-Hawkins has been in place for, 20 some odd years. And we say it has worked. It's been important that we have new construction. And unfortunately, we fear we're going to see less of it if this proposition passes.
Joe, what do you think would actually, you saying vacancy control you don't see as, very likely in a lot of places. What do you think would happen sort of on a local level if this passes?
I think the reality is in big cities, we're going to see single family homes and condos return to rent control, which is important for local communities. I've been in tenant rights for 20 years. During the first dot-com boom, we saw displacement. But people just moved down the street in San Francisco and in Oakland. Now we're seeing people moving to Stockton, moving out of the Bay Area altogether. And these are teachers, civil servants, people of color. I mean, our city has been gentrified, and Costa-Hawkins will return a huge amount of units to rent control to keep people housed in the city.
Deborah, obviously you see it differently. If this does fail, what do you think needs to happen moving forward? We do have a housing crisis in California.
We do have a housing crisis. I think what we've been working on in the legislature, obviously, we will argue it's about supply. We have Proposition 1 that's on the ballot, and that's to bring $4 billion to affordable housing. Because rent control, remember, there's no means testing. So a landlord's going to still have the ability to decide who's in that unit. And we saw in the 70s under extreme forms of rent control, we saw gentrification because owners still get to make that decision. But because there's no means testing and there's no way to determine who's in those units, the owner has a choice of the guy who drives the BMW or the person they're not really sure who can pay the rent going forward. You're going to take the sure bet. And I think that's most unfortunate because we've never been able to talk about means testing.
Joe, you want to respond to that at all?
Well, I don't know how means testing could even be carried out. I mean, a landlord is just going to pick a wealthy tenant. So in reality, I don't think it can play out in any way. Rent control works in its purest form. I mean, there's no doubt that rent control keeps people housed and keeps rents low when it's not perverted by state statutes. Costa-Hawkins is one of those state statutes that's perverting rent control and making it difficult for municipalities to administer rent control statutes. The same is true of the Ellis Act. The Ellis Act in Costa-Hawkins allows landlords to manipulate the system to take units out from under rent control. For years, we've been seeing Costa-Hawkins fraud. You folks might remember the landlord that raised the rent to $8,000 on the lady with cancer.
Yeah, that was in my neighborhood, actually.
In Bernal Heights, exactly. And then we see landlords committing fraud to do fake transfers to relatives and convert to condominiums when they're not allowed to because condominiums are exempt from rent control. So rent control works in its perfect form. The state statutes have perverted that, and this Proposition 10 is an opportunity to give control back to the municipalities to let them decide how their cities are going to look.
So, Deborah, I think you probably have a different point of view on what things like the Ellis Act and Costa-Hawkins have done to the market. Can you briefly just tell us, your response to Joe?
Sure. Well, Joe mentioned the Ellis Act. That's a state law that says you can't stop a rental property owner from going out of business. Unfortunately, under strict forms of rent control, owners leave. And with, again, if Prop 10 passes, strict forms of rent control, owners have the ability to go out of business. And the small mom and pops who have, in most cases, less than 10 units, which that is a large majority of our population in California, we unfortunately believe they will leave. And we saw that in Berkeley in the 70s. They lost about 3,000 single-family homes. And we think that's what's going to happen again. They'll sell their homes, and tenants are going to get an eviction notice instead of a rent increase, and I think that's so unfortunate.
All right. Thanks so much to our panel, KQED's Guy Marzorati, tenants attorney Joe Tobner, and California Apartment Association Deborah Carlton. Thank you.
Thank you.
Turning now to business, Brandless is an e-commerce startup based in San Francisco. The so-called anti-brand got its start in 2017 with a mission to offer quality products at a very low cost. Their inventory includes a broad range of everyday necessities, from food to beauty supplies to office supplies, each with a price tag of $3. To hear more about her company, Brandless co-founder and CEO Tina Sharkey joins me now. Tina, thanks for coming in.
Thank you so much for having me.
So everything at Brandless is $3, which is very low. Tell me what kind of products we're talking about.
Oh my gosh. Well, first of all, there are some that are 2 for $3 and some that are 3 for $3.
Oh,
so
wow.
Just to be clear, but yes, the whole idea at Brandless was to create a simple, organized, edited assortment of the things that you love, from the snacks, whether they are all non-GMO, mostly organic, lots of vegan, lots of gluten-free, from chips to crackers to cookies, you name it. And then in the essentials, so organic spices or organic all-purpose flours and baking mixes, extra virgin organic olive oil from Italy, and organic coconut oil.
Wow. So, and then you also do beauty products, home supplies.
So we have clean beauty. Everything is rid of the 400 ingredients you don't want. No phthalates, no sulfates, never animal tested, as well as personal care. So fluoride-free toothpaste, essential oil mouthwash.
How do you keep the price so low?
So at Brandless, you know, it's funny, you said we're the anti-brand, and we're like, not really the anti-brand. We're just redefining what it means to be a brand based on truth, based on authenticity, and being in direct relationship with the people we serve. That direct relationship is actually how we manufacture. So we create all these extraordinary products for Brandless, and we ship them directly to our distribution centers, and then we ship them to you. So all those intermediate steps that you currently have to go through that you're not even aware of, by the time you pull something off of a shelf, it's taken a long road from where it was created, and the markups and all of that makes the cost so much more expensive.
Was there a particular moment that sort of drove you to create this brand? You've been in business for a while and done a lot of other things that are pretty different from this.
Yeah, I would say, you know, what's interesting is it all started with my co-founder. Ido Leffler and I decided that we actually wanted to change the world together in our own small, humble way. And we were both doing lots of other things at the time, but we said, let's carve out the time and the space to actually figure out what's broken and what we want to fix. I came from building communities. I came from building commerce and media and direct consumer experiences, all digital. And he came from creating consumer packaged goods products. Okay. So I said, what if we were to like fuse it and build a community that's based on something that's bigger than anything that we sell? This whole idea that we could democratize access to better things at fair prices for everyone. And so we set off to do that. And it's only been a year. We just celebrated our first birthday a year ago.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
You kind of touched on this, but you call yourself a social capitalist. I mean, how important is it from a business perspective, too, to have a company that's sort of aimed at, you know, the broader good? That's not just, I know you guys give money to feeding programs for feeding folks when you buy something.
So we built Brandless for profit and for purpose. Oftentimes people will put purpose as a campaign, or they'll do it when they're profitable, or they'll do it as a one-day event. Profit and purpose is built into everything that we do, and it's critically important to who we are and what our community stands for. We partner with Feeding America. There's 41 million people in this country that go hungry every day. And Feeding America is the largest hunger relief organization in this country with the broadest network of food banks. When you check out at Brandless, we will purchase a meal through Feeding America in your honor, because we believe that the doing in life is what matters, and we don't wait for Giving Tuesday. every time you can do a tangible act of kindness, it's just kind of how Brandless rolls. So our community is always doing things. And in fact, as we celebrated our first anniversary, we'd already given away over 1.6 million meals.
Wow. So you have a lot of experience as an entrepreneur and an executive. You co-founded iVillage, which at the time was the largest online community for women. You were president of Baby Center, excuse me. How's the business landscape changed as a woman in tech and business broadly?
You know, it's funny, but I never really identified as a woman or a man in terms of who I was as a leader. I'm Tina, and I have my experience, I have my passions. I'm also a mom, I'm also a friend, I'm also a sister, I'm lots of things. But when I show up at work, I'm a leader who's there to build an extraordinary business, and I don't think of it as it's a female-run business. It's a business that fully expresses the commitment and passion of the people that come to work for us and the movement that we're building. And so I think the landscape has changed in that having that real seat at the table is something that's very, very important, because I represent not only my own business experience, but also my personal experience. And my, 89% of the purchasing in this country is done by women. Right. So the idea that women wouldn't have a seat at the table for any consumer business, let alone any business to begin with, is kind of crazy. But I don't think about it as, oh, I'm a woman, therefore. I think I'm Tina, and this is my experience, and I don't want to be labeled or given an advantage other than my skills, my passion, and what I'm building and executing.
Right, but those inherent experiences you bring to it, I'm sure,
absolutely,
shape it differently.
But that's because of what I've accomplished, and not just because of, what profile or cohort I fall into.
So what would be your biggest piece of advice for aspiring entrepreneurs?
I would say always be your authentic self, because authenticity scales. Bring smarter people around you that complement your skill set and complement what you can bring to the table. Always make room in diversity and inclusion. It's not just about color or race or ethnicity. It might be about style. It might be about approach. And so not everybody has the same approach to things. Right. But as an entrepreneur, part of your job is to sort of convene a diverse set of voices, a diverse set of experience, and a diverse set of opinions, and then surround yourself with people who actually want to stay with you and your movement for the long game.
Fabulous. Well, Tina Sharkey, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
That will do it for us tonight. As always, you can find more of our coverage at kqed.org/newsroom. I'm Marisa Lagos in for Tui Vu. Thanks for joining us.